Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with a donation deck of Saheeli the Sun's Brilliance, a copy deck, Splinter Twin style, coming from Royal Beast. Thank you so much, Royal Beast, for supporting the channel, and they say, "Hey Cursed, I built a new artifact deck and would like to hear your thoughts and potential improvements. The plan is to cheat out expensive creatures, either through recursion or free casts. For the win condition, I use regular combat damage with a bit of poison on the side. I usually use Saheeli for value or as a late game win con, but the deck isn't too reliant on the commander." And as for restrictions, they say the only restriction is to avoid tutors for the challenge. Absolutely. I think this is a really fun deck. Saheeli was a commander that really caught my eye early, and I think there's a lot of interesting things we can do with her. As for the deck itself, I think it is very straightforward, so instead of waiting around too much, let's get into it right away by taking a look at our commander. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Saheeli the Sun's Brilliance, and why are they our Splinter Twin style artifact commander? Well, Saheeli is blue-red for a 2/2, that's Izzet Colors Human Artificer, and she has one main ability, blue and a red, tap, create a token that's a copy of another target creature or artifact you control, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. It gains haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Now, I call this a Splinter Twin effect because that is where I am the most connected to that kind of ability, but this is simply kind of a red copy style where you lose the copy at end of turn, but you get it immediately and you get it with haste. Notably, it's also, you can do this at instant speed, that I think is a rather strong ability that you can use on opponent's turns if you can untap Saheeli or use other ways to get this trigger off. Very, very cool. Big fan. What can she do though? I will also add, I do really like Saheeli, but what can she do in this deck? I think she can do a lot in this deck. Without going straight into what we usually look at, it's easy to see that this deck is built with a fun kind of cheating out cards and making copies of them, with cards like Blightsteel Colossus, Ancient Stone Idol, Triplicate Titan. Cards that if we can get them out, make a copy, and sacrifice that copy, we're getting quite a bit of advantage there. Now, with that as our main kind of method of the deck functioning, there are some value plays, but they are less common. We kind of get an idea of where we're going. This is almost basically Saheeli Reanimator with Saheeli copy just kind of put into there at the last moment. Looking at the deck itself though, there's a few things that I immediately note. Well, starting with where we always start with, lands are 36. I'm a very big fan. We are playing quite a few mana creatures, and we have definitely some mana rocks here, including Mana Vault, so we are in a pretty good position there. Looking down here, we can see the curve is also generally very nice. We're kind of all over the place, with 5 being a pretty empty section, but overall, I do like what's going on. At 2, where Saheeli is, we have quite a few cards, in fact the most cards in the deck, but if you've watched before, you know that once your commander is like 2 or 1 mana, it doesn't matter that the rest of your deck is around that mana cost, because you are just always going to cast your commander, and at that mana cost being so low, it's not that much of a detriment, right? So I do particularly like that. But, and this is an interesting but, the first thing I noticed, and if you opened up the deck list on your own side and you were taking a look, I'm sure you would have noticed it too, there are no instant spells in this deck. Now, this I don't think is part of any challenge or any particular reason. It is just a factor of how the deck was currently constructed. And that really catches my eye. Like, don't get me wrong, I am one to say, you know, you don't have to follow the rules. You do not have to play, you know, all of the cards that every deck runs. And, you know, if you don't play, for example, any enchantments, you don't play any planeswalkers, something like that, it's not too bad. However, instance is not really where I would consider we can just throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you catch my meaning. I think we are missing out on a lot when we do this. Like, even ignoring simple things like, near and dear to my heart, Lightning Bolt, to very, very good, even, red and blue counter magic that can be very relevant, to almost any form of interaction, from bouncing to, other copy spells, or I don't know, there's like a million things here that are notably missing because we have no instant. And I don't want to start on this giant list of instant cards that this deck could, or if you ask me, should be running. I'm going to just let the deck builder or the viewer imagine what that list looks like, because you'd probably be about right. There's just a number of really good instant spells, including those mass bounce spells that we all like, that are just missing. Just put them in. This is also even including some artifact instant speed cards, some discard. I'm thinking of the discard cards that at instant speed you discard a card from your hand, draw 2, or the ones like Big Score, which just so happens, actually, I thought of it because it's on my desk right now. Cards that instant discard cards and then generate treasures. Like, these are all just good cards that we have access to that we are just not playing. And I think that could easily amount to 6 to 8 cards, maybe 10 if you're really in the market. And that would be the entirety of my additions regularly. So this is just like, imagine this hanging over the deck. And I know that gives it like a negative connotation, and I think that's kind of intended, but at the same time, that is just like, think about that, because if I just focused on that, the video would be over. So just keep that in mind as we go over everything else. Looking at the deck proper, because we do need to make some cuts, and those cuts will not be taking into, they won't be counting towards the instants. I'm going to just make the next bunch of cuts in mind for the other additions. So I don't know if this is a deck that needs like 15 cuts in order to make additions, but once again, I'll leave it to you. No, what I'm going to point out is the cards that I think are just a little too weak or uninteresting to me in terms of how much the rest of the deck really, really jives together. Like, if you look at a lot of this deck, we've got quite a bit of like cheating mana from, it could be like Reanimation to Master Transmuter to Goblin Welder, right? These cards that allow us just to get away with our giant creatures, or making copies of giant creatures, such as things like Phyrexian Metamorph, once again, Reanimation of Felden of the Third Path. These, I think, are the strongest parts of the deck, especially considering so many of them are creatures that tap for this ability. Being able to use Saheeli to create a copy of them, for example, playing Felden, using that ability, using Saheeli, making a copy of Felden, losing the first Felden, activating the second Felden, getting another creature. Though you might realistically ask me, but Curse, why don't we just use Saheeli to make a copy of the creature that Felden made a copy of? Don't worry about that so much. There's a lot of really fun things you can do with Saheeli that I like. So what don't I like? Well, I feel like there's just a lot of in-between cards, from the Mana Dorks specifically, from Mirror Convert to Plague Mill to Silver Mill to Iron Mill. Do we need these mirrors? Like, do we need this many of them? I don't think so. I don't really think they're doing much for us, right? They're really kind of cool, don't get me wrong, in a dedicated mirror deck, or in another deck that can really take advantage of the sheer mana you could produce by making a ton of copies of them or something like that. Even Ornithopter of Paradise feels, I don't know, feels just really out of place in a deck like this. Like, honestly, if this deck had 30 lands, which does happen, people send me those kind of decks, I would understand the inclusion of this many cards that tap for mana, but we're not doing that. So why do we have this many creatures that tap for mana? Even more so, I'm looking at cards such as the Enthusiastic Mechanaut. I'm looking at cards such as the Foundry Inspector. These are cards that reduce our artifact spells by one colorless. Or do we also have the 4 mana? No, we don't. I don't think we have any of the other ones, but if we wanted, we could have more of them. And I will admit that I do see a bit of charm and a bit of usefulness in these cards. Like, don't get me wrong, reducing a mana cost off of something like Duplicant, making it 5 mana when it's usually 6, and then using cards like Plague Mirror, Silver Mirror, and Iron Mirror to tap into Duplicant early. Like, I get it, it jives with me, but it feels just kind of secondary to the plan of cheating out the Duplicant or reanimating the Duplicant. And with 36 lands and enough card draw, I don't think you need to be playing all of these cards to cheat out Duplicant when you can just be playing lands turn after turn and play the Duplicant, right? Like, I don't think you're getting that far behind, because in that time, you should be doing other things like putting other cards into your graveyard and not so much dropping, you know, Silver Mirror, if that makes sense. Something else, just on the same page, I see Joyra Weatherlight Captain here. I really like this card. For the longest time, I had a Joyra deck that I never played. It's just decks without black. Why would you even try? But more to do with the fact that this is an incredibly powerful ability in a Storm deck. And this part makes sense to me with the Enthusiastic Mechanaut, with the Foundry Inspector, with the Mirrors that tap for mana, with the Copious Mana Rocks. Like, all of that makes sense. I get that. But in the current build, once again, I'm stuck in a situation of, but why though? Why are we using this here? Joyra comes out later than all of your early game historic cards, and by the time you are casting Joyra, you are probably it's more realistic that you should be working towards cheating in one of your high mana creatures. 4 mana is Felden 3 at 3 mana, and then 3 mana the next turn. 4 mana is Argivian Restoration that will reanimate an artifact card. 4 mana is Master Transmuter, and next turn you put the artifact creature into play. Sorry, I can't remember what the blue card is that does that. These are the cards that I think I'd rather you be playing at that mana cost instead of Joyra to get further value, when I think Divination would have just done a better job. A few other cards that kind of catch my eye are cards like All Is Dust. Really feels weird here. I love All Is Dust, but this is not the deck for it. I do understand that you can get a one-sided board wipe with All Is Dust, but if you have giant creatures that are colorless, and then you cast and you have mana for All Is Dust, and you cast All Is Dust, that's technically 3, they cast All Is Dust, and your opponents do not counter it, I think you were already winning the game, right? Like, I don't think that's going to be a situation that it's going to be that swingy, and outside of like Blightsteel and like, I don't know, a really good triplicate Titan that you've also had mana for Saheeli out, and also Saheeli was out, like, if all of these kind of converge on one point, then yeah, I'd say All Is Dust is pretty good. But at the same time, like, wouldn't another, you know, one-sided board clear be good enough? You know, one you could cast at instant speed, and that could, you know, bounce all your opponent's cards. I don't know if that's exactly what I'd suggest over All Is Dust, but I think All Is Dust is very clunky in this current setup. Looking at a few other cards, Hammer of Perforos, for haste, I'm going to suggest something else. I think the whole sacrifice a land, put in a 3/3 Golem enchantment is cute, but once again, I think we can just do a better impression of this with other cards. And even with 36 lands, are we really blowing up lands for this? Akroma's Memorial, a very, very fun card, do not get me wrong, but very much so feels win more in a deck like this, because if you are reanimating an artifact from your graveyard, is it gonna be this one? I would say most of the time not. This would be like maybe the 4th or 5th card you reanimate, because there's just going to be better options, right? I'd rather the Blightsteel Colossus immediately if I can have Saheeli mana. I'd rather the Meteor Golem or the Cityscape Level to immediately take out something. Akroma's Memorial requires you to have a board that can really use that, which is honestly some of these other cards like Wormcoil Engine, like Cityscape Leveler, right? Like, these are the cards that I'd rather come out, and then Akroma's Memorial. Like, this could easily be the Eldrazi Monument, I would prefer, right? Because that gives indestructibility and that gives flying, which I would say is generally, because this does give flying and trample, but flying should be enough, and the indestructibility is probably much higher. And this is a deck that can create at instant speed a copy to sacrifice to the Eldrazi Monument, which I prefer a lot more. And I believe that's 6 mana. I think I prefer that more than Akroma's Memorial. Anything else? I think Memnarch sticks out as not being a particularly interesting card. It's way too much mana for what it does, and you need to, even if you cheat it out in play, you need to have more mana, especially a lot of blue mana if you're using both abilities to steal your opponent's creatures, whereas that doesn't really work with Saheeli, and you're not particularly interested in making it work with Saheeli. Looking at anything else, I particularly like the artifact suite here. Obviously, Portal to Phyrexia is an amazing card, and I do really like it here. Skull Clamp obviously is very, very good here. A bunch of the intermediate cards are good. Sneak Attack is great. The sorceries are fine. Duretti obviously reanimates as well because it is trash for treasure. All that is fine. All right, with that in mind, let's go into additions. I've got a few for you here. I'm trying to lean a little more into the mid-range, into the card draw. A few options here and there that I think are rather interesting, because I honestly think your top-end reanimation plan is really good. I have like no notes on that. I think it's particularly strong. Gleaming Geardrake is one of those cards that works really well with sacrificing artifacts, which is going to be a few of them in this pile. Not just because I'm a big Aristocrats fan, but I believe it is a facet of Saheeli and the rest of the deck that you aren't taking advantage of, and I think having cards that take advantage of them while being just kind of threats on their own are really, really good. Gleaming Geardrake creates a clue, and when you sacrifice artifacts, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So early on, a 1/1 flyer that creates a clue, I think, is a pretty good 2-mana card. The fact that just as you play the deck, it grows is nice, but I will note that lately, and maybe it's just with the group I play with, especially on Mudsta's channel, that I really appreciate having an early flyer or early evasive creature, because someone tends to bring out initiative, someone tends to bring out the monarch, and I want to be able to grab that early and take advantage of it. Lately, I've found a lot of times where I have an opponent with initiative or opponents with initiative, I'm kind of hard pressed to grab it because I don't have an early evasive creature, and that by the time I get it, it's far too late. They've already like cleared the dungeon once at least, and I'm just starting it. So that's just another point towards Gleaming Geardrake, which I think is generally just a great card. Also, once again, looking at this as a pretty low bar, but a solid bar for a copy target, where you will get a creature to attack with and get a clue for 2 mana, which is the cost of the creature. I think that's pretty fun. On the other sacrifice artifact synergy list is Crime Novelist. This one is a lot cooler in my mind. It grows in the same way but stays on the ground, but notably as you sacrifice artifacts, you get red mana. Now, this one's more interesting because with Saheeli, it's a little clunkier because you get that red mana on your end step. So if you don't have clues to activate or an activated ability to activate, it might be a little trickier. However, it's not that bad because we have quite a few activated abilities that can be activated in end step and have something to gain from it. So for example, if we were to activate Feldon to get another value creature, we would get it because it is at the next end step. You would get it on your end step, or whatever end step a creature evaporates and sacrificed, and then that would last the entirety of the next turn, and then get sacrificed the end of that turn, once again generating a red mana and a +1/+1 counter for the Novelist. These are little things, especially if you're using your red reanimation or your red copy creatures to like get a value play, get back a Solemn Simulacrum, something like that, where you're not too worried about getting your giant reanimation creature in. I think that's pretty good. If not, in the meantime, it'll save you mana on cracking clues, it'll save you mana here and there, and if you're not just sacrificing artifacts on your end step, which is something that will happen, you are getting a little bit of value here and there. I think it's a pretty good creature, and I think maybe put it in. We've got some better options here, namely Goblin Engineer, which notably is a card that has a 1 red mana activation cost and can work really well by sacrificing artifacts, so lots of synergy with Crime Novelist right there. Goblin Engineer, oh, it's a tutor. Maybe I can't adjust this one. Okay, you know what? This is technically a tutor, so I will not add it because I thought of it for the reanimation aspect, not the tutoring aspect, but this is a 2 mana, unmarked grave style effect or entomb effect. So with that in mind, Royal Beasts don't play this, but for other players or other viewers who want to be building Saheeli, Goblin Engineer is a fantastic card because unlike a card where you look at that second ability where it is reanimating 3 mana creatures or artifacts 3 mana or less, and you're like, oh, okay, that's fine, that's value. You're really looking at this as an entomb card. You play this and you put Phyrexian, a Phyrexian portal, right? Portal to Phyrexia, sorry, right into your graveyard, or you put in, Triplicate Titan into your graveyard, preparing to reanimate it by other means. But that being said, if you are in a situation where you're playing the value plan, Goblin Engineer is fantastic in going and grabbing any 3 mana card, think there's like a prize totem or a number of artifacts like the Ichor Wellspring, where it has a benefit when it comes into play and leaves play, and you can just cycle through those every turn, getting basically quite a bit of advantage for just 1 red per turn cycle. So a card I do like. As for Royal Beast, I'd say maybe I believe there's a 3 mana version of this card that you tap it, sack it, and then you reanimate you sack an artifact to reanimate a different artifact that is lesser or equal converted mana cost. I can't quite remember what that is, but that's an option. The new Slow Bad will sacrifice artifacts to generate red mana according to its activated, to its CMC, which you can only spend on other artifact spells, but nonetheless, those are cards that I would think otherwise. One that really gets me is the Ever-Flowing Well. This is a card I really like suggesting. I never see it as much as I think it should see play. I think it's just a good card. Ever-Flowing Well is a legendary artifact, enters the battlefield, you mill 2 cards, and you draw 2 cards. Let's stop there for a second. With that text alone, it's a 3 mana sorcery speed divination. The upside that it's not just a divination is that you mill 2 first, and in a graveyard or reanimation deck, that extra mill 2 is kind of good. Is it amazing in Commander? No, but it's meaningful. Let's take advantage of it. But of course, the main perk of this card is, as it is an artifact, you can use Saheeli, tap 2, tap her, make a copy of Ever-Flowing Well. Now the well is a legendary artifact, so it is worth noting that it will evaporate the second it comes into play, but you don't particularly mind that. I think that's fine. You are still paying 2 mana to mill 2 and then draw 2 at instant speed, which I think is really, really good. And sometimes at worst, it's a divination. But what is it at best? Well, as we can see, Descend 8, if on your upkeep you have 8 permanents in your graveyard, which is something very, very easy to do in this deck, it flips to the Myriad Pools. So the Myriad Pools, I think, is really, really good, not just in the sense that it is turning card draw into a land, which is a preferable kind of deal you can get. It is also doing a whole copy thing itself, right? Changing one of the things you have on the battlefield into a copy of something else you are casting. This is something the deck also wants to do naturally. So just having access to another version of this, I think, is rather good. So this card, at its base, is a pretty good divination. At its mid, it's a repeatable divination. And at its height, it is something the deck already wants to do while ramping you by its mere presence. I think that's really, really good. This would probably be one of the first cards I'd put into the deck. Talking about threats, Kappa Cannoneer really catches my eye as a card that is particularly missing. This was a card that was tons and tons of money for a little bit when it was really good in Legacy, but only saw a Commander print. And then it got printed into Modern, which nosedive its price, which is really, really good. So you can get it for less than $1. According to this, probably less than 50 cents. But here's the thing with Kappa Cannoneer that I really like. In a deck like this, it is very easy to improvise out a 4/4 Ward 4 that just gets extra upscaling with artifacts. and that's pretty nice. It allows your deck to cheat out a really good creature, do what it wants to do, and the improvised plan is different than your main plan, so it doesn't really, it gives you some supplemental aid in getting these big creatures, but also you can just reanimate this card so it still works with your main plan. However, there's a big bonus I really like about the Cannoneer. The Cannoneer's second text is interesting because if we go back to the original printing, it actually just says whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature and it can't be blocked this turn. Do you notice it doesn't say another artifact? Kappa Cannoneer actually triggers itself, which is kind of weird, and the newer text on the card actually makes points this out by rephrasing it as whenever this creature or another artifact enters. So with that in mind, you get Kappa Cannoneer at any time. It actually is a 5/5 that's unblockable for the turn, but usually that doesn't matter because you can't attack right away. And herein is why I really like it for this deck, because with Saheeli and a number of other copy abilities that you have, Kappa Cannoneer does in fact get haste, which means it is at minimum a 5/5 unblockable creature with ward 4, so it's next to impossible to interact with it for most of your opponents. And with that in mind, it's a lava axe. It comes out, it deals 5 to your opponent. But that is the baseline for it. If you have your Kappa Cannoneer and you create the copy Kappa Cannoneer, say that 5 times fast. The copy Kappa Cannoneer is a 5/5 unblockable, but the original Kappa Cannoneer gets at least one more trigger, so it is at least a 6/6. But then, if you want, before you go straight into combat, you could just do things your deck is already doing and play 1 to 2 more artifacts. All of a sudden, the copy Kappa Cannoneer is at least a 7/7, whereas the original is like 9 or whatever. It's huge, and you get 2 unblockable attacks. Yeah, the second the copy Kappa Cannoneer gets evaporated at end of turn, however, you don't mind, it's done a bunch of damage with very little effort on your end. Really, really like this card. This one is very easy at the top of my include list. I think it's really cool. And if you've actually never had a chance to play with this card, I really recommend it. It is extremely powerful. It is a commander card that was good in one-on-one that I think is still very good in commander, so that speaks to its power. A card I'd like to talk about really briefly is Idol of Oblivion, and I want to talk about this because this is a card that I put into a lot of decks, and lately, before I put it into a deck, I always think to myself, is this card good enough? And most of the time, the answer is yes. Because the way I look at it is, would I play a 2-mana, I always think of them as Phyrexian Arena, but draw a card every turn card? And the answer would be almost universally yes. If I could pay a 2-mana card that drew me a card every turn, I would play it. And then I try to be objective and think, realistically, how often is this going to trigger? And most of the time, the answer is every turn. Because of the means of not just having a deck with a commander that generates tokens, and a deck that just happens to generate tokens anyways, Idol of Oblivion is rather good to just have it happen every turn. That's not even just including the fact that this is an amazing target for Saheeli, because you create a copy of the Idol of Oblivion, creating the token necessary, and then you tap both idols to draw 2 cards. That's fantastic. And that's only if you have nothing else to copy, because if you just copy a creature you want to keep, or not to keep, you want to attack with or make a copy of, Idol of Oblivion is just like, yeah, that's cool, I'm into that. And if you're saying, well, what happens if Saheeli is just not on the battlefield? I've had Idol of Oblivion for a few turns, they killed Saheeli. What am I going to do when this card just doesn't have tokens being generated? And I'm going to say in most decks that can run this, you have the means to create other tokens, and the few triggers of Idol of Oblivion you'd get off of Saheeli should probably have drawn you into one of those cards. And I would argue if there's a card that draws you 3 cards over 3 turns for 2 mana, and then stops working for a few turns, I think it's done its job at 2 mana, right? Like, a lot of these cards would be pretty happy with that result, so I'm pretty high on this card. Now here's a really big suggestion. This is Broadside Bombardiers. I believe this, once again, is a card that sees play in Eternal formats where commander cards are legal and is a commander card, and therein why it's like $12. This is an immensely cool card that works amazingly well with this deck, because this is, first of all, a Menace Haste Boast creature, 2/2 for 3 mana, and its boast is sacrifice another creature or artifact, and then you do that sacrificed card's CMC +2 to any target. That's the full sentence. I don't know why I'm pausing. You deal that much damage to any target. Now, what's really cool about this is you can use this to protect the Bombardiers and do some cool things with Menace to ensure that the Bombardiers does hit because of how Boast works, right? But that is how Bombardiers works by itself. How does Bombardiers work in this deck? Well, first of all, this is a fantastic Saheeli target because it has haste already, but gets haste. Menace is really good, and then Boast allows it to get 2 triggers off of this and have 2 artifacts like Mana Rocks or something else you don't want anymore or something you want to go in the graveyard. Throw both of them at 2 different targets, take out some really valuable targets that your opponents have, or just hit them in the face and get away with it. That's not including the value when you have a very big target, such as Triplicate Titan to throw. You attack with the Broadside Bombardiers. Yes, you don't immediately use the ability, but as soon as combat's over, the Triplicate Titan gets thrown, and then you get the death trigger, and your opponent gets hit in the face for, I believe, 9 damage at least, right? That's really, really impressive. Even then, you could just do it mid-combat, say, you know what, I don't mind the Triplicate Titan not hitting, I'll just use it now to ensure that I can get, damage through, or I can, not worry about blockers. I don't know. The situation is whatever you want. The versatility of Boast is just really, really good. And should you, have nothing else to do, end step, you have things that are going to be evaporating anyways, Broadside Bombardiers is more than happy to be sacrificing those things end of turn to deal damage. Just really, really good card. I think honestly strong enough to be in any version of this deck. Coming to the end, we have Mass Hysteria. This is just a card that I always like suggesting in decks like this. I believe that we have other, like the Hammer is the haste enabler in the deck at 3 mana, and I'd rather this just be at 1 mana. I've said this before, and I'll say it a million more times. Mass Hysteria is great when you want to make sure your creatures hit, because it incentivizes your opponents to tap down all of their creatures. There's not a lot of situations where they won't attack or do something with all of their creatures, and it gets better if you can then, on the next turn, reanimate a really big threat and make a copy of it. And all of a sudden those creatures are attacking right away, which is twice as much as they would attack regularly, and you're taking advantage of that because your opponents don't have blockers. This also obviously works really well with Saheeli because you want that ability to be active as soon as possible. So being able to play both of them in one turn, honestly, if you could play Mass Hysteria, follow it by Saheeli, follow it by activation, with no commander attacks, that's 5 mana, which I think is a pretty good deal for that. That's not even including if you have Mass Hysteria out earlier, that's 1 less mana, good deal. I'd say this is the kind of card I like in most red decks. Coming a little more into the weird category, Reality Chip is a card I really enjoy. And when we're in Artifacts and we're in blue, I have a really hard time not advocating for this card. I know this doesn't work as well, or it doesn't jive as well with the main Saheeli game plan, but this is a card that I really think people should consider. It is Future Sight in 2 pieces. Future Sight, of course, is the card that lets you cast spells and play lands off of the top of your deck. Reality Chip is a card, and that's 5 mana. Reality Chip is a 2 mana card that's an 0/4 that does that with a 3 mana equip that turns on the ability, which also, once again, that equals 5. So with that in mind, splitting that 5 into 2 is really good. The Reality Chip as an early blocker, as an 0/4, is pretty good. The fact that looking at the top card of your library is always active, also very, very good. Finally, just the ability in a deck like this to be able to turn on Future Sight is great. This might be more questionable than anything else, especially because this deck does have scenarios where you're going to look at your top card. It's going to be one of those, you know, reanimation targets at like the 9 mana creatures, and you're just not going to be able to do anything with it, and that's going to suck a little bit. That being said, that can turn on cards that would be self-mill, and that could be useful, but you'd have to play more of that. If not, I think most of the time you'll be happy with the reality chip. This is Nebulous. I'm throwing out there because it's a card I really like and I think is powerful, but I'll leave it up to you to decide. I believe this is the last card. It's Steel Overseer. I wanted to throw this in here because as much as I started by saying I want the mirror out, if there's a universe that you wanted to go and keep all the mirror in, and maybe you're building a version of this deck that doesn't have the reanimation package, and we're looking more for like a middle of the pack, mid-range value version of Saheeli, I think Steel Overseer is pretty free to play. I know it's not as impressive as it once was, it's pretty slow, and yes, we can target this with Saheeli to get an additional +1/+1 counter on all creatures, but that bar is pretty low these days. Still, with all that in mind, I did want to point this card out because it is something that people do like, and at the fact that you can get this, seems to be about 50 cents. This can be good for budget lists, and it can be really good in more flavored lists as well. I'll leave it up to you. All right, for the last card, we've got Breath of Fury, and this is a card I really find intriguing here, but I'm a little bit unsure of the power level. See, the way this works is really, really interesting. What happens is you get Breath of Fury on an evasive creature, whether this be a flyer, a Kappa Cannoneer, or anything like that. You go to combat, and you attack and you hit with that creature. Once that creature is going to hit or has hit with this trigger on the stack, you make a copy of it with Saheeli. Then this trigger, the second half of this card, resolves, you sacrifice the creature, you attach it to the copy of the creature, and everything untaps. Then you do it again. Now this isn't infinite because it costs 2 mana every time for Saheeli to do this. But in the meantime, you get a lot of advantage and a lot of attacks every time you do this. So this can be a really good spell to kind of get you ridiculously far ahead, or take advantage of sacrifice triggers to grow creatures that attack over and over again. And in certain builds where you have creatures that generate mana on attack, that can pay for the Saheeli triggers, and that can be used to just go infinite. But in this current build, I still think it's really, really cool, and with some of the ETB creatures you could get, or you could use with something like this, you could even just use this card fairly, right? And by fairly, like, it's still unfair, but let me put it this way, right? If you have 3 opponents and one of them doesn't have blockers, you can just use Breath of Fury as intended, where you have a bunch of weaker creatures that aren't very valuable, and you just cycle the Breath of Fury onto them, and each of those like 1/1s, 2/2 small creatures attack the player that has no defenses and give you additional combat steps. During that time, you are attacking the other players with your Kappa Cannoneers, your evasive creatures, your gleaming gear drakes, and you're using Saheeli to create more copies of those really powerful value creatures, which then have haste and can then further swing at your opponents. Like, I really think any way you slice it, this is a really cool card for Saheeli. And depending on the builds you have, depending how you want to swing it, this is probably better or worse, but I think it's very, very cool nonetheless. I had one more. Oh, I thought this was the last card, but Intruder Alarm is a real card. I don't really think I need to speak more to this. I think Intruder Alarm works a little bit like the previous card, where this just allows Saheeli to keep triggering over and over again, and it's like makes her into this intensive mana sink that can bring you so much value. But with that in mind, I'll leave that up to you. This might be bordering on, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but this might be bordering on too good for a deck like this and turn your opponents all against you all at once. But I think that's fine. This turns a turn where you have any multiple of 2 mana into that many copies of like anything. Like Blightsteel Colossus goes from, oh cool, I have a hasty Blightsteel Colossus, to I have 4 Blightsteel Colossus, and all my opponents have untapped creatures, but it doesn't matter because that army is going to be able to take out all my opponents at once. That being said, there's some like kind of not as much fun things about it. I will say stuff like, you know, it can get janky, your opponents can use this against you really, really well. But I think it could be really fun, especially with your other activated ability reanimation cards. Goblin Welder and the like will definitely be able to use this really, really well. You might get some groans from your opponents, though. I'll let you decide on that in the end. And that, for sure, is the final card of my additions. Thank you so much, Royal Beast. I really do like this deck. I really like this kind of artifact reanimation plan. I think it's very, very cool. I will say, I do think the lack of instants is something I'm very much so missing here. I know we've got options from like Pyrite Spellbomb, and Aether Spellbomb, which is marked as 2. I wonder why. Regardless, I get why they're here. I know they're trying to make up for the fact we're not playing lightning bolts, we're not playing bounce effects, we're not playing counter magic. I still think you're doing yourself quite a bit of a disservice by not playing these incredibly powerful staples of the game. You know, the amount of games I've won because my opponents didn't draw into their removal, and now I imagine the games I could have won if my opponents didn't run removal. I think it's very much so something the deck is missing. Otherwise, I hope my additions were helpful. I hope the cards I picked out were, they make sense why we would remove them. But yeah, I'm excited to see more of these kind of decks. I really do like them, and reanimation outside of black is always a blast for me. With that in mind, good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there is a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you, and good luck in brewing and building.